Hello, what's up? This is Silas here. I'm back with Steven. You can introduce yourself to the
Hello,
people.
everyone.
This is an ongoing conversation we've been having in our conversation series about different topics. This one is specifically about postmodernism and critical theory. And Steven has been reading this book, or he read this book called Cynical Theory. Cynical Theories? I
Cynical.
keep getting the name. You tell us a little bit about the book.
So, Cynical Theories is written by James Lindsay and Helen Pluckrose. They're two academics. They wanted to explore what's sort of been colloquially called the social justice scholarship, but it comes out of postmodernism as well as the Frankfurt School, especially the critical theory aspect of it, uh, where it came from, how it's affected academia, and how it's playing out in the culture today. All the things going on in the country are largely a result of this. So, they wanted to delve into it, break it all down, and explain which schools of thought came from where, which thinkers, how they evolved, how they adapted, etc.
Yeah, and this is something that we both think is somewhat important, and we've done. This is going to be, I think, the fourth part in this series. We did an introduction one where we talked about a few different things in it, and then we had one where we just talked about something that was taken from the book about the general definition of what we mean when we say postmodernism. And then we did a section that was on going into the details of what was the last one we talked about?
Post-colonial theory.
Post-colonial theory. So we talked about that. That was a section. And today we're going to get into critical race theory and intersectionality, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Right.
That's going to be the first part we record today. We might record other parts. Those other parts are out before I've posted this one, and there's going to be more parts to come. You don't have to watch those before you watch this. I think we're going to try to make these to be independent conversations that are timely, that you can come back and you can look back at. And I think we'll make the case that this is affecting the world. This is affecting governments. It's affecting your schools. It's affecting people around you. There might be certain things you've seen in the world and you're like, okay, what's going on with this? And then maybe it's like, wait, it's actually due to this thing. So it's good to have this information. I think one thing right now as we're recording this, there's a current pandemic going on in the world. We're recording this in 2020, and you might be aware of that. And a simple thing, a simple example is we just did this one post that I'll have a separate video about, where it's talking about a study done to show how the biology of a certain groups of people might change how much they breathe of the possibly contaminated air. And then people go in and start talking about, oh, you can't be talking about these things. What do you mean? Race is not biological. It's all this and this. Like, this, do you know anyone in the editorial staff that that has studied critical race theory? And this is going to top level. So it's actually affecting policy now that people are reopening the world and things like this. They're talking about things like the Build Back Better plan. That's been something that started decades ago, actually, but it's been something that the UN is using. It's something that Joe Biden in the United States of America, the Democratic presidential candidate, is using. And these things involve things like things from the postmodernism school of thought, from critical theory, from critical race theory, from these kind of things that are going in and are going to be part of the building blocks of the systems that affect us, whether you know about the actual details or not.
Sure.
Anything else to add to that?
Well, I was just going to say that's the whole reason again why the authors wrote this book, because they wanted to say they know a lot of people see this stuff and it looks very complicated, hard to understand. So they said, let's break all of this down. Let's explain who contributed what. Here were their contributions. Here's what it means, and then here's how this is translated to activism and policy today. But it's done in a very it's still it's not a huge book. I think it's about 300 something pages, but it's condensed enough where they include the important points, but you don't get completely lost in the weeds. And then, obviously, if you want to delve further in, you can read the people directly. But this is meant to summarize broadly their ideas.
Yeah. And this is something that we've had previous conversations about different topics that involve this, like you are what you consume. That's one of the first conversation series we had, talking about mostly food, but going further and saying the ideas you consume also make who you are, because humans are more than our just biology. It's not just that. But now this is kind of the basic building blocks. This is the basic things. As he said, it's condensed. This is an alphabet of sorts. It's the grammatical rules. So we can both be all, or we can be on the same page when we talk about certain terms, and you can also understand why can somebody say everything is racist, everything is sexist, everything is homophobic? You'll be able to understand why somebody can say that because they're coming from this background. When somebody says critical race theory, this is what we think they mean from the information that's out there and from trying to follow some historical reckoning of this person said this and this person came to say that, and the first person who really wrote down and started spreading this idea of critical race theory meant this. Now, if you come and you think when you say critical race theory, it doesn't fit what we're about to talk about here, feel free to write in the comment section or to try to contact us or give some sources of why you think we're discussing is inaccurate and why what you are discussing is actually more accurate to what critical race theory is. Because in some cases, if I say, oh, it's a really cold day out, it's not going to be the same thing for everybody who hears that. It might be cold for me at 72 degrees Celsius, or is it Fahrenheit? I don't know. One of the two, because even at just that again, if I say it's 72 degrees out, it's very cold. If you're thinking Celsius or Fahrenheit, that's already going to change what you think about that temperature, let alone whether it's actually you as a human being living in a certain climate for your life and having a definition of what hot and cold is. Okay, so I think that's good for the intro.
Sure, we can
Yeah.
jump right in.
Now, as we mentioned, there's other ones, so we're going to get right now directly into talking about critical race theory, and I'll throw it to Stephen to kind of guide us through this conversation.
Sure. So I wanted to sort of start by explaining broadly how this sort of came about. It's been debated, and of course this happened in your post as well, about how much of race is a social construct versus how much is biological. This argument goes at least back to people like W.E. Du Bois, who argued that there's a lot more similarities and differences between the races, but people come up with the differences to try and justify bigotry. I mean, obviously, you look at Silas, you look at me, we look different, skin color, hair type, all that. So there are clear biological differences. The question goes, aside from that, how many differences are there? And there's sort of been this debate back and forth about, okay, if you break things down, how many differences are there really? And it's been known for some time, of course, that people evolve differently based on their environments. I mean, obviously, Silas's family came from a much hotter, humid climate, so that's going to affect skin color, hair type. My ancestors, of course, came from colder climates. But what's interesting here is that biologists and geneticists don't focus so much on race, at least as we typically define them. They focus more on population groups. Now, I recently did 23andMe, and it's pretty interesting. I can send people the results if they have any interest, but for me, I have strong markers for Germany, but notably Bavaria and the North Rhine-Westphalia region. And it's interesting because I've been delving into my mom's family history, and those people actually did come from North Rhine-Westphalia and Bavaria, so that seems to be right. For my Polish ancestry, I don't know how to say it in Polish, but I think it translates as Subcarpathian, but it's the southeast region of Poland. I have very strong markers for that area. And that's kind of interesting, too, because my dad thought they came from more of the north, but then you wonder, okay, did people move around, all that? And then for Italy, I have the strongest markers for Campania and Apulia, Campania is basically the shin if you think of Italy as a boot, Apulia is the heel. That kind of makes sense. And then I also have some markers for Russia, but the Russian part is interesting because it's called the Moscow, I think I'm saying it correctly, Oblast, which is the area surrounding Moscow. So I thought that was interesting because as big as Russia is, my markers line up most closely with people from that exact area. So who knows, people may have migrated back and forth and all that. But again, broadly speaking, these are referring to different population areas. It's not, okay, you're the Russian race, okay, you're the Polish race. No, it's people from these specific areas. So and then, of course, with you, like you say, you have different tribes, and then, of course, debated which tribes lived in which area. These tribes conquered these people. I know in South Africa, the Bantu, who were an offshoot of the Zulu, displaced people that were there previously. So if you go back far enough, okay, what do you categorize them as? Are they this tribe? Are they that tribe? It becomes complicated. So biologists try to look in terms of the markers, not in terms of broad races. We've just sort of simplified it to make it easier for classification. And also, I mean, as you and I have talked about here in other discussions, the definition of white has changed over time too. When I first heard Thaddeus Russell talk, he even brought that up, how for a while, the WASP basically viewed Irish and black people the same way. They were both seen as
Yeah.
inferior. But then the Irish wanted to sort of be accepted, so they started adopting racist views as well, and then they were seen as white. And they also fought in the Civil War. That was another big part of it. So of course, then it can be debated. Okay, well, what is white? How did that change over time, and all that? Do you know the Children of Ham's story as far as Africans are concerned?
Is that Children of Ham one? Is that related with the Mormon mythology?
I don't know if it's Mormons, but some of the older Christians believe that Ham was the son of Noah, and he sodomized Noah, and then he was cursed with black skin and exiled. So for a while, it was believed that Africans were descended from Ham.
Yeah. And then you
Yeah,
have things like we're talking about with the differences with what is black, white, what those
yeah,
terms mean. I think they're very specific to the United States of America because when I was spending some time living in Italy, and the Romani people, which are people from Romania, the gypsy type of people, they're called black. They actually call them
yeah,
niggers.
yeah,
Like they actually use like negro and nigger, like those terms are called black people in most of Europe because they're just in that group, and they also in general tend to be darker than your average. I think the average person who thinks of Europeans thinks more of the lighter skinned people, which is mostly Eastern Europe and the colder climates, thinking Scandinavian type of people, Caucasus Mountains themselves. As you had mentioned, you're talking about different regions. When
yeah,
you're talking about these different things in your 23andMe, that's actually from different regions and groups of people that were rather locked, but they still moved around and what actually
yeah,
happens. And for me, part of why I've never felt the need to do the 23andMe thing is I think it'd be rather boring. I think it would just be like the Luya tribe of the people who lived in Western Kenya in that area. You just track them back. There was some movement of greater tribes moving in the Horn of Africa area and things like that. But I think it would just be that all
yeah.
the way until, yeah. And we also don't really have as many, at least from what I've seen with the actual studies, they haven't tracked as many of the different tribes and um, different genetics in Africa. Maybe they've done more about that now and they're starting to get those books out, but I think some of those divisions are still a lot clearer. Those tribal divisions are still a lot clearer, like in the genes in Africa than they are, of course, in a place like Europe that has had due to the geography and due to other political reasons, they've had a lot more intermixing of the genetics of the people from different regions than you had in Africa until relatively recently.
Well, I was going to say it's interesting too because my last name is actually classified as an Austrian name, but it's a Silesian dialect. Now,
Mm-hmm.
Silesia, it was named by the Romans, but that region today it's mostly in Poland, a little Czech, a little Germany. They're not even clear where the name came from. They think it's a reference either to a mountain or a river. It's been lost at this point. And
Yeah.
some of the markers I had in my Polish heritage were for I forget the name of the region in Polish, but it was the Silesian something region. So it is possible that it became classified as an Austrian name later, but of course, Austria-Hungarian Empire covered all that area. And then for my Russian heritage, it makes sense too, because Russia ruled Poland at various times, so people moved back and forth, or
Yeah.
people, who knows. So it's unclear. It's like, okay, yeah, it became classified as an Austrian name later, but originally that was Silesia, and yeah, it gets complicated.
Yeah, and the names used to mean words used to mean words. Like names used to mean something. Where it's like if you have this name, that means you are from this location. Occasionally, the name was literally like you were of this person, and then with the way the name is worded, it's also with a language and a dialect, so people could just hear somebody's name, be like, "Oh, this is a person from there." Just like it still is here in Kenya, you have different Luya names, different Kikuyu names, different Kalenjin names in general, but then some things are different. Like I asked my parents about the origin of our name, and it wasn't necessarily specific something to do with that language. It was actually somewhat derived from the Maasai tribe when we are of the Luya tribe. So there are these different conventions that go in where things get mixed up, and then now we have higher technology where we get things like the 23andMe, these DNA tests, and start finding more detailed information that's descriptive but not prescriptive about anything to do with that information.
Well, it's interesting because with me, so my last name it's Kirschner. We say it that way, but it's really Kirschner.
Yeah.
In the standard German, the Hochdeutsch, Kirsch actually means cherry, but in this particular dialect, it relates to fur and leather. So my ancestors were furriers, presumably they tan. I guess you'd say tanner or furrier. They were people who skinned animals and then made fur or leather out of them. And then what's really interesting, I don't know, do you know my mother's maiden name?
No.
It's a very strange coincidence. So it's Kirchner. It's the last name, but it's minus the S. So,
Okay.
but then, yeah, I always get grief for this, and she has too. But what's funny is that her name, it's a Saxon German name, and Kirche means church. So it was like a church caretaker, a Saxon. So the names look almost the same, but if you look up the etymology, they're completely different. My father's name, it's a Silesian Austrian name. Mom's name, it's a German Saxon name. But again, because they look so similar, and there's always that confusion. What's your mother's maiden name? Kirchner. And they're like, no, her maiden name. It's like, no, Kirchner. That's it.
Yeah.
And then people will see relatives on her side comment, and they're like, oh, is that a relative? I'm like, yeah, but it's on my side. Just a really funny coincidence.
It's interesting with those conventions, those naming conventions. What does the things change? Like, I just, I don't know what I was writing an article about somebody I went to high school with, and last name was Inga's daughter. And then I was like, wait, Inga's daughter? Like Inga's
Sounds
daughter?
Icelandic.
Like, and then I was like, oh, that's why it's like Inga's daughter. It's like Eric's son. It's like Eric's son, Inga's daughter. Like, the things that are in there. Then you just mentioned Tanner there. I have a friend who's somebody who's named Tanner McCoy. In some places, Tanner might have been the what the person does might have been what's the first name was, and McCoy might have been like the clan name. This is the family that the Tanners of the McCoy families. So it might have been Tanner McCoy of the Highlands or Tanner McCoy of the Loch, where it was like, okay, this is Tanner of the McCoy clan, the McCoy clan that live by the Loch. Like those are kind of conventions that were in there, where I think words are a lot more practical and direct in some certain words and certain naming conventions, and then those things kind of changed. And now people just kind of, a lot of people who are hearing this, probably your name was probably just, oh, this was somebody's inspired by somebody in some religion or some uncle or some other things. Your parents just picked a name that they thought sounded good, and you can also kind of tell, like, like Elon Musk's kid. What's the name? It's like a couple of letters,
Yeah.
epsilon something something. So there might be some names where you can also hear and be like, okay, there's some conventions. Like this is kind of a joke type of thing. The hyphenated names, just the same way they're dash studies, where you're like, okay, someone has majored in something in hyphenated studies. You can kind of tell something about them, and then you can also maybe kind of sort of be somewhat overgeneralization with, if you are from a parent that has decided to not take the name of the husband or keep one name and have a hyphenated thing, there might be certain conventions to you being raised in a certain social political worldview about the world. And then also with those people, I wonder if there's two hyphenated people and they have a kid, is it going to be like 4 last names that all have hyphens in them? Or do you pick 2 of the names from what happens in those kind of situations?
Well, it was funny because I knew a guy. He was Hispanic, and I guess his mother had remarried a bunch of times. So formally, his last name was something like Baez Fernandez Rodriguez something Toro, but we just called him Toro because it was like, nobody's gonna say that every single time.
Why did he take all those names? That's the thing. There might be a cultural thing for them to take on those names, but I don't
Yeah, I
understand
don't
why
know.
they take on so many names.
Yeah.
My little trick on that is, if I do get the chance to have a kid, I think I'll just give them one name,
Yeah.
and then they'll be able to, once they get to 16 or whatever, they'll be able to pick another name and pick a middle name or their last name, I think. Or I might decide with the mother of the child, like, let's give them first and last name or whatnot. We each pick one name. And then when they get of age, they can go and pick another name for themselves, whether it's their middle or switch whatever with their order. Because it makes sense to have a name. And then there's certain cultures where it's like, okay, they don't give the name until the kid is 5 or something or comes of age. And that was mostly based off of things like, oh, the spirit could be lost, or the spirit comes into the body, you know more about the identity of the child, or you don't want to name a child before they're of an age where you think they'll survive. There are other things in there. There's interesting things in there. And that's why with these progressivism, with this kind of critical theory type of stuff, reimagining, you don't need to reimagine things, but there's many things about history, about the world, that we can pay more attention to without having to garbage and change the things that already exist. Like if you want to add stuff to it, add stuff to it. But this whole idea of going back and just being like, we're going to rubbish all this stuff because of reasons and replace it with this stuff that we say is true because of other reasons,
Yeah.
I'm not for that.
No. So getting back to the biological thing, it sort of gets complicated here because they were saying with the Enlightenment that sort of gave rise to naturalism, which is sort of like a proto-biology, and this is a bit before Darwin, but this was sort of the beginnings of people saying, hey, wait a minute, maybe these people evolved differently based on their environment. Now, where this gets complicated is that this has sort of become one of the criticisms against science, and Thaddeus Russell actually said this to Helen Pluckrose in one of their conversations about, oh, this was used for eugenics, this was used for all this, but then she explains, well, first off, I mean, this was earlier on, and a lot of this wasn't proven, these were just hypotheses. It's sort of like the analogy that I would make is that nobody subscribes to Aristotelian physics anymore. We realize it's full of errors, but the point is it paved the way for people who delved in further and ended up getting things right. You had Aristotle who tried to figure things out, made a lot of errors, but then, okay, Isaac Newton and company picked up on that, and then Einstein continued from that. So it's a similar thing here. You wouldn't say science is invalid because the early people made mistakes. It's, well, not much was known, but you have to keep asking questions and keep researching before you decide.
Yeah. And the thing is with eugenics, a lot of people who talk about how we need to respect the science, we need to respect the experts and things like this, also tend to bring up things like eugenics. And I'm like, hey, that thing with eugenics, what you're talking about? That was the science. That was the experts. So this whole idea that we're just supposed to respect what people say because they have an MD or because they're an expert in this and this, no, that's not accurate. Like, the actual facts are facts regardless of who is saying that fact. Regardless of whether I know something is true, I could say right now in Timbuktu it's raining. It's either raining or not. I don't have to be an expert in Timbuktu. And there's a good chance that there could be somebody living in Timbuktu right now, but they're in a basement and they've never come out of that basement for the last 2 or 3 days. And then they say, well, I live in Timbuktu. As an expert that lives in Timbuktu, you have to believe that I'm right, that it's not raining, even though Salah says it is raining. Either of us have a 50% chance of being right. Neither of us, because we're in that location or not in that location, has some higher insight unless we're literally standing outside under the sky and seeing if it's raining or not. So, yeah.
Well, it's interesting you bring up that raining analogy, because I remember I was reading a book of the history of philosophy, and they talk about Karl Popper and the whole philosophy of science and his emphasis on falsifiability, and he actually uses the raining analogy as an example to prove his point. Like, did it rain outside? Well, can that be proven wrong, yes or no, and how do we do that? And his point is, you can't just say, oh, it rained because it was wet, because that water could come from other things. I mean, that could have been a fire hydrant leaked, maybe a truck carrying water spilled something, all that, who knows? So the point is, you have to be able to go back and verify that, and you can either go back and check footage from outside, you could check the weather forecast, but you have to provide the evidence to prove the point. That's ultimately what he was getting at.
Yeah, like rain itself is an objective thing. It actually is something. There is an actual situation that is either rain or not rain. It's not simply water on land, existence of water on land. There's so much that goes into it where it's where I think that gets lost a lot.
Sure. All right, so that's about it for the first part. Then I'm going to start talking about where critical theory came from. Did you have anything else to add before I continue, or?
No, so that's done with the critical race theory aspect of it, or are you talking about?
Well, no, that was just sort of what gave rise to this, and then I'm going to delve into how did it formulate?
So how did it formulate it now into the actual what's called critical race theory now? Because this is an aspect of critical theory, not necessarily just okay. So yeah.
All right, so this started in the 1970s, came from Derek Bell, who was the first tenured African-American professor at Harvard Law School. His expertise was what's called critical legal theory. I think you can pretty much tell. The idea was to examine law and find out what prejudices, biases, and blind spots were in it that weren't being addressed. He wanted to address it in terms of race, of course. From the 1960s, progress was being made, but a number of people, he himself included, they saw it as not being enough. There was a book written much later. This is in 2017. It comes up a lot as a source. It's called Critical Race Theory and Introduction. That's been on the required reading list for some curricula now. The authors' names are Richard Delgado and Jean Stefanich. It's a husband and wife team. They wrote Unlike traditional civil rights discourse, which stresses incrementalism and step-by-step progress, critical race theory questions the very foundations of the liberal order, including equality theory, legal reasoning, Enlightenment rationalism, and neutral principles of constitutional law. Critical race scholars are discontented with liberalism as a framework for addressing America's radical problems. Many liberals believe in color blindness and neutral principles of constitutional law. They believe in equality, especially equal treatment for all persons, regardless of their different histories or current current situations. So you get the point here is that they were sort of going away from the colorblind approach, which Martin Luther King, everyone's heard the speech by now, and others advocated of, no, I just want everyone to be treated the same under the law. I don't want people to think of race. I just want everyone to be treated the same. They were arguing that this didn't go far enough to address imbalances. So they had to re-examine the whole idea again, constitutional law, Enlightenment, rationalism, all of that. So any thoughts?
Yeah, with the law situation, it's definitely the situation of the criminal justice system will improve. It has a lot of space to improve. It's been a lot worse in the past, and it still is open to many biases. They try to select for that and say, oh, if the jury has actually been tampered with or has been unduly influenced by the coverage of it, we have to go to another location. You have to move the case to somewhere else. Or they do the test for the jury duty and they try to recruit people randomly and then say, oh, it's a jury of your peers. They have different ones where it's just a judge and then they're trying to base it off of the law. The system is not perfect. I'm not trying to state that. I don't think they can be a perfect system of law even. Because you look at the perfect systems of laws that people think of when they talk about deities and theologies, and those are even much worse than the things I actually see. There's no infinite punishments, for example, for finite actual, although maybe there's a kind of like original sin type of thing where it's like, let's infinitely hold the white people guilty for what a few slaveholders did, but then we can't hold any actual black people guilty for crimes they might have committed a few years ago. So there's those kind of things. But so when you come to this critical race theory, one of my main things, whenever you talk about the actual things and you see something and you say like, okay, let's pick car robberies. And we look at, say, okay, whenever we've got 100 car robberies involving a black person, and then 100 car robberies involving a white person, let's not even add who the actual victim of that car robbery is, because I think you might find it to be more of a case where it's more biased towards black people robbing more cars from white people, but then that's a predominantly white country, so more cars on the road on average will be owned by white people. So let's just get the 100 on 100. And then you count the times of the sentences, and you say the black people were on average sentenced to 5 years in prison with a 25% conviction rate. The white people were sentenced to an average of 4 years in prison with a 20% conviction rate. And then you say that's a signal of the thing. Those are the kind of things that I see, oh, that's a signal of the bias in the system. I can already think of a few different things, like what were the priors for these people? Yeah. How many of those white people actually decided to plead to a lower kind of deal? What were the locations these people were in? Because you can't just go like across the globe, across the country, and say, oh, the basic kind of the basic kind of sentences for certain crimes in Alabama might be different in Maine. So if Maine is 93% or 95% or whatever it is white, and then you're getting 50 of these people come from places that are 95% white, and then you get to a place where it's like, okay, in Alabama, they happen to be more black people there, which is maybe 30%. So more of the actual people come from there. They're going to be subject to a criminal justice system that has a higher number. That's something I can just clearly see. Well, is that selected for in some places? Maybe. And the last thing on that, I think anything that you see, and if somebody agrees that just that, without adding all these other things, is a reason to show there's a discrepancy, and that is a clear discrepancy, the discrepancy you would see between these 100, or let's put those two groups together, 200 men who stole cars on average. Now, if you add I think I said 5 and 4, so it's 4.5 years for those people with about that would be about 23% conviction rate. You get 200 women that stole cars, and you'll probably find there's a 5% conviction rate of the women who stole cars with a 1 year actual average sentence from those 200 women. So whenever I see a figure being brought up about discrepancies between blacks and whites in results in the criminal justice system, I look at the discrepancy between females and males, and it's much more biased. If you're saying that's a sign of bias, it shows that the country is much more biased pro-female than pro-white in any of that kind of argumentation. Is that something you've seen as well?
Yes. Well, what I was also going to add, I mean, Thomas Sowell has been talking about this for decades, and Wilfred Riley has more recently too. How if you equalize a lot of these factors, like if you look at like two-parent families, what the family's income is, where they live, people in the South are usually poorer, all these things, a lot of these disparities virtually disappear. Because, for example, people down South on average are poorer. Okay, there's more black people down South, that's one thing. I think a lot of people, too, will attribute things to race when it's really more like class. Like, for example, the analogy that comes up is somebody will be pulled over in their small town and the police will recognize them and let them go. And then they'll be like, oh, this is because my white privilege. It's like, well, no, you're the son of a wealthy business person. You're in a small town. Everyone knows everyone. The police knows who you are. So, yeah, you got away with that versus in the inner city, if you're in a dangerous area where there's a lot of crime, the police who doesn't know you is going to be less trusting because to them you're another potential criminal. They don't know you as a person. They don't know your family, all that.
Yeah. So even like you don't even have to be wealthy. It's just this is the guy that I know him at the bar. I saw him at the barbecue last weekend. Like I know he literally lives across the corner. If I let him go, he's not going to drive like for an hour more on the road and then end up hitting someone. Like I know he literally lives 10 minutes down the corner. There's nobody on that road. He's going to go home and get in the house. Why should I arrest this guy for that? It's just there's so many things that can select for these biases that I don't necessarily see being actually addressed for in the studies and things in the few times that people actually point out studies. Because often it's this, as we mentioned before, the word is just thrown out there: racism, structural racism, systemic racism, without actual evidence to back that up. It's a magic spell. It's a glamour. It's not something that's actually based on reality. It's based on that assumption that we talked about in postmodernism, that the only objective truth is everything is racist, everything is sexist, everything's homophobic. That whole oppression narrative is the thing that you're trying to work towards. What'd you say?
And you have to point it all out.
Yeah, and you have to point it all out. Like I feel like I should cut. I might clip that. I feel she might actually go to the point where she would strike the video if I did that. But just to get like a clip where every time I think of saying it, I just play the clip of Anita Sarkeesian saying that. Maybe I could just get another female to read it in a voice similar to hers, and I can be playing it. But yeah, all right, so keep going.
Getting back to Derek Bell, so in 1970 he wrote a book called Race, Racism in the American Law, and he described what's called interest convergence. Basically, the idea was that white people would allow black people to have rights if it was in their interest to do so. He said this explicitly in another book in 1987 called And We Are Not Saved, The Elusive Quest for Racial Justice. He said, progress in American race relations is largely a mirage obscuring the fact that whites continue, consciously or unconsciously, to do all in their power to ensure dominion and maintain their control. So one of the things he was critical of is that he believed desegregation was not about giving black people freedom, but it was more about to placate the black radicals, especially during the Cold War, because I know Moscow had specifically said that they wanted to use socialism. They wanted to appeal to minorities who were resentful and saw themselves as under attack, so they could help spark a communist uprising. And then he also argued that these problems would continue because of things like white flight and white retaliation. People wondered about a resurgent Klan or police cracking down, all that. So Bell, in line with the title, had a very cynical view that no, these things are never going to change unless we overhaul the whole system because white people won't allow it
to. Okay. And when was this?
This was he started in the 1970s, but he wrote another book in 1987. He's no longer alive. So.
Yeah, but this is the thing. Some of these things are relatively recent, and in one sense, I think, like I say, this is something that is just descriptive of what the state of the world is. This is a very relatively recent thing. This was written in 1987. You go back 40 years before that, that was 1947. The world had just come out of a world war. This is now 1987, and it's about 30 years after that. Is it 30? All right. Yeah, it's about 30 years after that.
Yeah.
So when people look at these things, like, oh, the world is ending. If Trump doesn't win, the people are going to take over the world and going to destroy the world, and civilization's going to. No, it's not that serious. I mean, it's something that's there to be aware of, but realize how new some of these ideas are that you can get out there. It's not. It has spread around, but it has spread around, I think, relatively unchallenged. It's not because it's gone through the rigor of the sunlight of the arena of ideas. What's the thing that like Stefan Molyneux says? It's like you subject ideas to the sunlight.
Sunlight is the best disinfectant.
Yeah, sunlight is the best disinfectant for bad ideas. I don't know if he originated that or somebody else said that. But some of these things haven't really been spread around as much. Just like on the same end, like I say, with the people who see these racist issues and say like, oh my God, I can't believe this happened. Look what this policeman did. Do you literally think that in the 60s, there was fewer policemen who were literally racist and going out and attacking people because those people were black as the primary reason than today? No, that's not the trend. You look at the thousands of interactions a day that white policemen have with black people in the United States of America, and the percentage of the ones that actually end up violent is a lot fewer than it was even 5 years ago, even 10 years ago, let alone back in the 40s and when in 1987 when this was being written. So I think that's something to keep in mind, that this stuff is relatively new. There's a lot of time to discuss and see if this stuff is accurate. Some of the things were being pointed out from observing a world that no longer actually exists in reality. So these are things that I think we should keep in mind.
Yeah. Well, and as I sort of said in the last video too, what gets me is they always bring up things from the past. Like they talk about like, oh, we have to decolonize. There was so much racism, but then they cite stuff from the 1860s, and it's like, what does that have to do with today? I mean, yeah. I'm not going to defend it, but it's like you can't put people today and that in the same category. I mean, if anything, that shows how much we've progressed.
And that's the thing. When you go with the progressive, it's like for claiming to be progressive, you kind of ignore all the progress that has gone on. It's that kind of part. To talk about postmodernism, it's like, yeah, you kind of ignore it. You actually, this might be better to be worded as pre-modernism, where it's not. We're looking at the past rather than the things that are happening in current year. There's some aspect of that involved in this.
Well, I recommend you watch that debate with it was a conversation, but it became kind of a debate with Thaddeus Russell and James Lindsay and Helen Pluckrose. Mm-hmm. And Pluckrose makes a very good point at one time, like, because Russell is a postmodernist and he's critical of science, and she basically says like, well, look, I mean, science has progressed and brought about all these great material comforts, so we have the luxury to sit around doing postmodernism. Like she goes, I didn't die in childbirth, as used to be a common occurrence, so now, okay, I can sit here and say, hey, is this really true? Hey, do we believe this? We have the luxury to do that now, but you have to ignore all the progress that came before, which created an environment that allowed us to do that.
Yeah. And that's the thing, like I had that one video about the white pill, taking the white pill, where it's like you can point out at things that white people have done. You can say, because white people came to Africa and took away some, what was it, 400,000? No, was that 400,000 slaves? It was less. It was a 400,000.
Well, in the U.S., it was about 300,000.
Yeah, it was 300,000 to 400,000 slaves. Because they were taken from West Africa to the United States of America, that means that Africa has been reduced by, you can upgrade that to say, let's say each one of those people, let's say you divide them just into couples and you don't actually point out that it was mostly males that were taken on that actual thing. But let's just say it was half and half, and each one of those people were coupled up, and they would have, on average of the kids that they were having at that time, let's say 3 at the small range, and you multiply that up, and then you say, okay, from that, there's technically 10 million or 20 million people in Africa fewer because of that. Then on the inverse, you say, okay, I can pick one thing, penicillin or something like that. I can pick just like a general medical thing that a white person invented, and then I can say that invention has led to the existence of how many Africans who didn't die from a basic thing. So has that evened it out? Like, when do you actually get to the point where you say, okay, this is what we're going to focus on versus that's what we're going to ignore? That's an issue that I have again with.
Look at all the look at all the anti-malaria stuff. I mean, how much of an issue is that there? I mean, millions used to die from that. I mean,
You're one of those drum tards. You're trying to bring hydrochloroquine into this conversation with your anti-malarial drugs. But yeah, something like hydrochloroquine has actually saved a lot of people in Africa and things like that. And there's arguments that whichever pre-effects with hydrochloroquine, the few things, no, let me say it right, hydroxychloroquine, the very few things that are with that is something that you take. It's a prophylactic of sorts. It's not something that you're supposed to take once you're really suffering the effects of that are related to the COVID-19 CCP virus, whatever you want to call it. So they have that in there, and there's some arguments that because a lot of the populations in Africa have been dealing with malaria and having some drugs that are similar to this antiviral malarial drugs that seems to reduce the chances of you actually catching COVID or getting the negative effects of it. That being in certain systems and different biologies that you're dealing with might actually undo some of the inverse things that we talked about with that post that I mentioned before, with just having bigger nostrils and breathing in more and things like that. So there's different things to kind of balance this stuff out or to think about that. For me, it's just the most beautiful time to be alive. Just tons of information. I get information about something and then I just find out there's exponentially more, like 10 more questions once I get an answer to one thing, and it just branches off. It's just fun times. But yeah.
All right, so to continue on, broadly speaking, black activism went into two different directions. They're known as the materialist approach and the postmodernist approach, which is different from the liberal approach. The classical liberal approach, which became in some circles left liberal approach, which is more about let's remove barriers to opportunities, let's help create better equality of opportunity, all that. Whereas the materialist was more about, okay, let's completely overhaul the economy, laws, and the body politics, and the postmodern approach was more focused on language and discourse. The materialists actually advocated things like segregation shortly after segregation had ended, black nationalism, things like that. Now, the materialists did focus a little more on empirical data, but it seems a lot like cherry picking, composition fallacies, taking the worst of certain aspects and applying it to the whole, things like that. Then the postmodern approach took off later. That was more in the 90s, and that focused more on things like whiteness, representation, hate speech, safe spaces, cultural appropriation, all that. This had a lot to do with the influence of black radical feminists in particular, especially Audre Lorde, who I mentioned last time, about the one who wrote the essay about not using the master's tools to tear down the master's house. There's also Patricia Hill Collins. They talked about how white supremacy was related to patriarchy. Then they talked about how it showed up in law, literature, politics, etc. This paved the way for another wave of activists, Patricia Williams, Angela Harris, Kimberly Crenshaw. She was a student of Derek Bell's, who helped him come up with critical race theory. And she also will be the founder of intersectionality, who we'll get to later in the discussion. They took a more postmodern approach, focusing on discourse and power, and they were influenced heavily by standpoint theory. Anything to add? Or?
Yeah, it's just interesting to see with these things where these are things that humans created. The human organism has certain things, like we were talking about before about the races, how you have the different tribes where eventually people from different locations are developed by their environment, and then they eventually mix with other places. And then once you have enough of those things mixed together, they now are identified as a different organism or a different race, a different selection, different collection that's made of these different things that are more individual and separate. And now it gets to the point where you can go into the DNA and say, oh, this part is due to this part is from there, this part is from there, but all these parts are who Stephen is right now. And you can see that kind of with these ideas, where you can say some of it came from the liberal school, some of it came from the materialists, some of it came from the postmodernists. Yeah. And then what you normally see on the average person on Twitter who's posting about these things may not know the specifics. They might not have their 23andMe equivalent knowledge of what their ideas are coming from, but they're getting that point that's been distilled and mixed and intersectionalized and taught to them in their schools, and now that's what they're acting on. If you actually ask them for the details, they wouldn't be able to tell you. Just like if I told you, like, could you actually tell me before the 23andMe where exactly you've been come from? You wouldn't be able to know. You'd be like, oh,
Yeah.
maybe this region because of this and this, but I don't know the details. So I think that's kind of interesting how you see these similarities with the different structures that humans have created, actual social constructs that humans have created, ideological organisms. They match the patterns of the living organisms that created them. So yeah, I just think that's kind of interesting.
Well, it's interesting too, and I'm sure you've seen this in discourse, sort of the conflict between the postmodern lines of thought versus the Frankfurt School lines of thought. Because if you think about it, Marxism, then neo-Marxism, and the critical theory of the Frankfurt School, this all follows a modernist framework. That is, it's supposed to be based on reason, it's supposed to be based on science, all that. Now, obviously, it errs in a lot of those errors, but they were more about, no, these things are objectively true, this is supposed to be based in science, we can prove it, all that. Whereas postmodernism is supposed to throw all that out the window. Oh, we don't know what's true, this is all subjective, all that. And I think when you engage different people, that's where you run into these conflicts. Because on the one hand, no, this is absolutely true. On another hand, well, that's your truth. That's your perspective. And it's like all these things can't be true simultaneously. But that's where you sort of see in these lines of discourse that they borrow from these actually conflicting lines of thought. That it shows in these inconsistencies in their discourses.
So it's kind of a thing where it's like ideas are descriptive, and
Yeah.
then ideology is prescriptive.
Yeah.
Because ideology has an aspect that requests you to act in a certain way. If it's just something you have in your mind where you're just like, I think white people are better than black people, but I don't actually act on it. It's just an idea I have. But if all my
Right.
actions, when I act, I treat people as individuals, that has nothing to do. But now, if you go out and you don the KKK like hat or whatever the equivalent of the modern day is, and you say, oh, we have to have black only spaces because blacks are different from whites, and blacks are better at doing this than whites. Whites are worse at this. And when you get to that point, now that comes an ideology because that is prescribing actions based
Yeah.
on the ideas.
Yes.
Uh, yeah, I think
All
that's
right,
it.
so start here with Patricia Williams. She focused on commercial law and wrote her autobiography. It was called The Alchemy of Race and Rights. She wrote that in 1991. This is pretty recent.
Alchemy. Why would she intentionally use the word alchemy? We were just talking
she
about how this is magic.
she focused on discourses. Okay, so that's coming from Foucault and how they shaped the Constitution and the law. She focused heavily on the social constructionist view of these. Um, so you can see here's the Foucault influence, and she's trying to explain, okay, how did these prejudices and biases get embedded into these laws that we take for granted because they were written by white men? She focused heavily on positionality, which is relates to standpoint theory. That's basically your position in the world affects your understanding of it. She even says early on in her book, subject position is everything in my analysis of the law. She goes on to say, I am interested in the way in which legal language flattens and confines in absolutes the complexity of meaning inherent in any given problem. I'm trying to challenge the usual limits of commercial discourse by using an intentionally double voiced and relational rather than traditionally legal black letter vocabulary. So, yeah, it's a little hard to follow, but basically she's saying
Intentionally
how
double lettered. Is that like an admission to doublespeak?
it sounds like it, yeah, but she's basically saying that, oh, these laws were written by white men, so I'm trying to sort of challenge that and show, okay, how are their biases and prejudices embedded in them?
Okay.
So another
That's,
thinker here, sorry?
I
So
mean,
another,
that's you see, that's a thing we mentioned before. I think if you listen to the postmodernism thing we talked about, this makes sense when you understand the premise that they're coming from,
yeah.
that they're trying to find the oppression in this situation because that's the one truth. So that makes sense.
So another thinker here, Angela Harris, she took what Williams did, but she applies it to a multiple conscious standpoint theory. So this is sort of foreshadowing intersectionality, but she didn't call it that specifically. She said, it is a premise of this article that we are not born with a quote-unquote self, but rather are composed of a welter of partial, sometimes contradictory, or even antithetical selves, quote-unquote. So basically the idea that you're approaching things from different aspects of your identity. Again, she didn't frame it as intersectionality, but she was sort of foreshadowing that. So some core tenets from critical race theory from Delgado and Stefanich. They wrote, Racism is ordinary, not aberrational. Heard that before. A system of white over color ascendancy serves important purposes, both psychic and material, for the dominant group. The quote-unquote social construction thesis holds that race and races are products of social thought and relations. And lastly, a quote-unquote unique voice of color exists, and minority status brings with it a presumed competence to speak about race and racism. So you sort of see some themes that come up today, that racism is common, it's not aberrational, that the system set up by white people and serves to benefit us both materially and psychologically, and the unique voice of color. I like the analogy that James Lindsay used to describe, we'll get more into it on intersectionality, but how they would say that because I'm coming from a dominant perspective, white, male, straight, able-bodied, etc., that I see the world in black and white, and then they would say that a colored person, they would say maybe you see the world in black and white and red as well because of your identity. Then for a woman, she would see maybe, a white woman would see black and white, but also maybe blue or something. And then, okay, if it's a black woman, it would be black and white, blue and red. And then, you keep adding in colors. And their argument would be that I don't have the competence and I could never understand because I just see everything in black and white. So if there's something red behind me, you would be able to identify it because of your identity, but I wouldn't be able to because I'm blind to it. That's how they would argue.
Yeah, I mean, those are assertions to make, but as I mentioned, it's just about the evidence. What are the reasons why they say that? If it's something just trying to get back to the whole, we have the premise that everything is oppression, and this is what would be an explanation for why or how everything can be oppression, that's starting from an answer. That's putting the cart before the horse. So that one I don't really agree with, but yeah, the assertion is there. If anybody else has actual evidence to why this is accurate, have at it. But I haven't found that yet. I think every individual does have a unique way of looking at things, that depending on certain characteristics that they share with other people that they can be grouped in, there's chances are there's going to be certain ways they actually approach things or deal with things. It's like someone who's literally blind is going to have a different experience of a film than somebody who can only see in black and white than somebody who can see in the average sort of way with all the colors. That's a clear thing. There's also the basic ones where biologically females apparently in general can see more of a color spectrum than males can. That's why there's more males who are colorblind. These are certain things. So that whole idea, biologically, I am admitting that biologically there's certain things about the way our genes make us in nature that will change and affect how our nurture exists. But then my issue again with what these people say is some of these very same people say there are no actual biological differences between these groups. But I'm like, then how are they actually experiencing the world differently if you're saying there's no actual biological differences? And then if you say diversity is a strength, diversity can't exist if there's actually full equality. Like, there's just so many things that are just going against each other.
So, critical race theory, it started in legal studies and went to other disciplines. Delgado and Stefanich once again say, although critical race theory began as a movement in the law, it has rapidly spread beyond that discipline. Today, many scholars in the field of education consider themselves critical race theorists who use critical race theory's ideas to understand issues of school discipline and hierarchy, tracking, affirmative action, high-stakes testing, controversies over curriculum and history, bilingual and multicultural education, and alternative and charter schools. So basically, it's applied to everything. They go on to say, political scientists ponder voting strategies coined by critical race theorists, while women's studies professionals teach about intersectionality, the predicament of women of color and others who sit at the intersection of two or more categories. Again, I'll get more into that below. Ethnic race studies courses often include a unit on critical race theory. American studies departments teach material on critical white studies developed by critical race writers. Sociologists, theologians, healthcare specialists use critical theory and its ideas. Philosophers incorporate critical race ideas in analyzing issues such as viewpoint discrimination and whether Western philosophy is inherently white in its orientation, values, and methods of reasoning. But then they continue, unlike some academic disciplines, critical race theory contains an activist dimension. There we go. It tries not only to understand our social situation, but to change it, setting out not only to ascertain how society organizes itself along racial lines and hierarchies, but to transform it for the better. So I think you can pretty much see how this spilled out in everything. They took this framework and applied it to everything: law, sociology, politics, even medicine, everything. This is, of course, this led to white people can't be racist because racism is power plus prejudice.
Black
You
people
need
can't
to
be
shut up and
racist.
listen. Yeah. The concept of racial stamina, you may have heard of that. Of course, being colorblind means you're ignoring racism. That's where all of this came from.
You see now they've let go the whole knowledge is power type of thing, because if you say, as somebody who's all these other things on this progressive stack, you have the ability to see more about how the world is, isn't that technically more knowledge? But maybe if they assume that knowledge doesn't exist, the only knowledge is that it is oppression, so you're technically not really seeing more of what is there. Because if somebody was saying knowledge is still power, being able to see more colors would technically be more powerful than the
Yeah.
person who can't see those colors. So would the people who actually see more colors be more powerful and be more capable of being racist? But let's not try to hold these people to basic levels of rationality. So yeah.
So just one more quote from Delgado and Stefanish. They said, remember this is talking in 2017. As this book went on to press, students on several dozen campuses were demonstrating for quote-unquote safe spaces and protection from racially hostile climates with daily insults, epithets, slurs, and displays of Confederate symbols and flags. I don't know where that's actually happening, but okay. These quote-unquote campus climate issues are prompting serious reconsideration among university administrators, and for good reason, if you say so. With affirmative action under sharp attack, universities need to assure that their campuses are as welcoming as possible. At the same time, a new generation of millennials seems to be demonstrating a renewed willingness to confront illegitimate authority. So, yeah. This is writing in 2017, obviously very recent, but it's the result of all this ideology in academia for decades.
Yeah. And I think now with that should make more sense to why you see people bring this up. You see a post, for example, I mentioned about that COVID test with the different nasal passages and structures. And someone's like, don't you have somebody on your editorial board that has studied critical race theory? Because they have the assumption that this is something that can go into everyone. Maybe you will get into more in that with the intersectionality to show how it's been able to parasite onto other things.
Yeah.
And so they expect it's about everything. Everything is racist. Everything is sexist. Everything is homophobic. And we need to, what was the thing?
Point it all out.
And we need to point it all out. So that's the thing. That's a key thing. They feel the need to point it out all out in video games, in medicine, in advertising, in sports, everywhere. It's supposedly a full spectrum. It's a way of life. It's a way of looking at the world and making sense out of things that they use. So this is not. We're not saying you have to use this. All we're trying to say is, all I'm also trying to learn is, when they say this, this is why. This is the basic kind of thing they're coming from on this.
Well,
Yeah.
it also goes back to that analogy about industrial solvent. Like, there's that solvent that can dissolve glue on anything. That has its purposes, but you don't dump it on everything. You don't put Drano on everything. It's going to destroy your rug, your furniture, whatever. You realize, okay, this has its purposes. Let's evaluate. Okay, are there prejudices here? Are there blind spots? Yes, but you don't. That doesn't mean you say, okay, everything has to have this on it. You're just going to destroy your house. I mean,
Yeah, this is like a duct tape or like a cabbage. Cabbage can be used with so many different things, so many different meals in so many different ways. And also like duct tape is this like the one kind of thing that's used multi-purpose wise. But no, these are very specific things that could affect and could have made sense to certain issues and at certain times. But if you bring them up, don't be surprised if I try to ask you for some evidence to why you find this to be the tool to use to discuss a certain thing. Yeah.
So then, next little bit, is critical race theory a form of applied postmodernism? Yes and no, because it borrows from postmodernism with the discourse theory and also the emphasis on language. depending which thinker. Some people focus more on language and deconstruction, a la Derrida. However, the difference here is that postmodernism rejects stable and fixed identities. Again, Thaddeus Russell's point about what is white, that kept changing, all that. Whereas some of these thinkers, their contention with this is, well, no, I can't escape being black. That's not something I can deconstruct. I'm always going to be black. I'm always going to be seen as black. So I can't deconstruct that. Some of them actually criticize Foucault and Derrida, basically saying these are privileged white men. They don't understand, typical. So Bell Hooks, you've probably heard of. Her full name is Gloria Jean Watkins, but that's her pen name. She complained about this in an essay in 1996 called Postmodern Blackness. Basically, she said that only privileged white men had their voices heard and recognized. Angela Harris wrote in her essay in 1990 called Race and Essentialism and Feminist Legal Theory that feminism had failed black women because it basically treated their experiences as a variation of white women rather than focusing on the racial aspect. So it was seen as, okay, this is just the feminist experience applied to black women, that's it, but it doesn't get into, okay, what other challenges they face. And this sort of thinking is what paved the way for intersectionality, which I'm about to get into. Any other thoughts?
I've just been thinking about just the way childhood affects you. They talk about adverse childhood, the adverse childhood score and the effect that has in anybody's life. And we look at a culture as an organism, as a society, as a tribe. What is the adverse childhood of the black race, let's say in the United States of America? What are the effects of coming up in that American descendants of slaves history, coming through the civil rights movement? What were the certain patterns that were being selected for that would make individuals in that organism have a higher success rate at reproducing and continuing? There was some aspects where you had to be deference, but you still could be strong about your actual identity. But in public, you had to signal some sort of deference to the controlling power, the white people or whatnot. So it did make sense for you to go out there and be like, no, screw you white people. You're not responsible for everything. There was something in there. So there's many things that are in there that I think maybe some other people have looked into it, but I've been thinking about this recently. What are the effects of that? How many of those effects explain how certain trends within that community are expressing themselves now due to the adjustments they had to make to just exist as a culture under the levels of oppression that they were under, and the levels of oppression and separation from the cultures they were in before, because the culture they were in before were normally people who caught them, enslaved them, and sold them off. So they didn't have the ability to be on the internet and let's see what's happening in Ghana anymore. It was like, no, just completely cut off from that and starting afresh. It's tough. It's a rather unique group of people in the world, and that's why I'm saying they're rather different from. It's not an African issue. There's a difference between African American and Black, because it's a very unique history that I think should be looked at in specific ways.
Well, because that's, to sort of contrast it, that's what they talk about with the Jewish experience, how their experience is way different, because they faced some vicious persecution as well, but they adapted to it in different ways. In some areas, like in Eastern Europe, they lived in their own areas, they spoke Yiddish, all that. I know there's that expression beyond the Pale that comes from the Pale of Settlement, because that was the area in Russia that Jews were allowed to live. That was it. If you were Jewish, you had to live here. Whereas in Western Europe, they assimilated a bit more. I know a lot of them changed their names. Like, I didn't even know till a few years ago how many comedians were Jewish. Like Jack Benny was Jewish. His real name was Benjamin Kubelski. The Three Stooges were Jewish. George Burns, Ben Stiller, as well as his father, who passed away recently. Joan Rivers, a lot of them would change their names and they'd sort of assimilate. So many people just didn't know and they just didn't care. So the experience was different. Yeah.
And that's the thing. People don't understand how much there's so many things that could select for that. Just the different adverse environments that they lived in could have selected for a certain personality type that was able to observe and communicate what was going on in a way that was pleasant enough to the majority outgroup that they were living in, that has led to them being able to better identify and observe the communities they live in, and communicate that in ways that are pleasant and acceptable. So there's so many things that go into that select for these things that I think we do need to pay attention to and take into account.
Did I tell you the story about my great uncle changing his name?
No.
So my Polish great uncle, he was one of my grandmother's brothers. He came to New York City, and I guess he faced a lot of prejudice. They didn't want Polish people. I guess because it was the whole, like, the WASPs didn't want these Catholics and whoever coming in. So he actually changed his name to Walter Miller. His name was Momolsky originally. And my grandmother was confused because they were getting all these letters from a guy named Walter Miller. But apparently he said, there were those old signs up saying no Irish need to apply, but there were also signs like nobody with a name ending in SKI allowed to work here and things like that. But then again, of course, the argument they can make, like with the Jews, is that, well, they could sort of blend in easier because they could change their names or lie about who they were and all that. Whereas, of course, black people didn't have that advantage. So.
Yeah. Yeah, there are things like that. Like, I remember in high school and middle school, Polish jokes are one of those very common things to do, to make. That's something that's still kind of a cultural artifact that still existed. I think it was definitely more common to make Polish jokes than any other like outright anti-black race jokes. Yeah.
Well, did you see that the story about that kid who was selling his classmates the N-word pass? That whole story.
I think I saw it in passing. I don't quite remember.
He basically said, "You can call me this, but you have to pay me." And the kid ended up making like $800.
How young was he? Wasn't he like in middle school or something?
Yeah.
Entrepreneur right there.
All right, so now we're going to get into intersectionality.
There's also stuff like that. Sorry, just mention this in passing. Like, there's certain things with issues. There are issues that do exist. Like, you look at certain majority black community areas that happen to be in urban centers due to various reasons of happening with the slavery, and then post-slavery, the places they migrated to, leaving the South, or once they were in the South, the places they moved to. There's many reasons to why the black community seem to congregate exponentially more in cities than they do in the rural areas. But now when you come into that, due to the different systems of law and the legalizations of different things, what is legal and what isn't, there's a lot of entrepreneurs who've gone into things that in certain communities that are considered illegal, like the drug trade and things like that. It's a risky trade. It's going out there, you get into the thing, you're understanding supply and demand, different ways of actual marketing the thing, getting the thing. We're going to have people who, these runners, instead of us actually selling the drugs, we're going to put in this position, have kids who are below 16 who can't actually get arrested, actually run the drugs. And you figure out these systems, supply chains and all that, but it's considered illegal. Yet you have that entire field that has actually sucked up a lot of entrepreneurial talent in that community because that was a way to actually make money. So there's different things where I do understand there's certain things that do affect people in different ways due to what is legal and what is not. So we shouldn't just look at legality, illegality as a sign of what's moral, immoral, and things like that. I don't know.
I was revisiting Gangs of New York again, and I had forgotten there was the character Jenny. It was Cameron Diaz's character. Some women used to do a thing, they called it being a turtle dove, where they would dress up as maids and they would infiltrate these rich houses, and then people would just assume they were help, so then they would steal things and then sneak out. That was another.
Yeah,
things like that. Anyway, moving on to intersectionality. So this was started by Kimberly Crenshaw, who was a student of Derek Bell, helped him come up with critical race theory. She introduced the idea in 1989 in a scholarly law paper called, it's a long name here, Demarginalizing the Intersection of Race and Sex, a Black Feminist Critique of Anti-Discrimination Doctrine, Feminist Theory, and Anti-Racist Policies.
Okay, one second. So Kim Crenshaw is in generally agreed as the person who initiated the field of intersectionality?
Correct.
And this is a black female philosopher?
Yeah. So she was in Derek Bell's. She was a lawyer. She's a lawyer by trade, I think, because she was studying at Harvard Law under Derek Bell.
Okay. So, and this goes talking about the society's not ready for black female power and things like this. When this is a major field that has affected the world in many ways, and that was invented, but it was coined or initiated by a black female lawyer. So there's out there. We don't have to say the ideas themselves, but then the people weren't like, let's rubbish this idea because it's a black female.
Yeah.
She was in Harvard to begin with. It's just like she was like a janitor in Harvard, and then on the walls, like writing things occasionally, like some lunch lady. Like, no, she actually had been admitted into Harvard.
Yeah.
So yeah, okay.
Yeah, so let me see here. Oh, yeah, and we'll get into her in another discussion, but Judith Butler.
Sorry, just mentioning the Harvard thing. There was a thing I just saw recently, like the Princeton president sent out a letter saying Princeton is inherently racist,
Yeah.
and then Betsy DeVos started a government probe into Princeton to see if it's racist. It was like a funny troll. Like she's like, okay, if you say you're racist, then we're going to look into that. So, yeah.
Pull your funding.
Yeah, that was a good troll on her part.
It was, yeah. Okay. So we'll get into her in another discussion, probably queer theory, but Judith Butler, who has started queer theory and she influenced feminism and other things, they think that she was talking about intersectionality around at the same time. She didn't coin the phrase, but she talked about competing identities within people. So you could even say this is one of those things that emerged sort of simultaneously from a few different people, but Crenshaw, I think, was the one who really codified it and put it into a concept. And I think most people watching know what intersectionality is, but the idea that you have intersecting identities, no, you don't just approach things as being black, but if you're a black woman, that's going to affect you in different ways. The analogy, of course, was that she compared it to intersecting roads, and that she was saying, okay, if you're black, you could get hit from one road coming at you. If you're a woman, you could get hit by another road. If you're black and a woman, you could get hit from two directions, all that. And her argument, she used 3 legal cases, I guess, to make the point. And the challenge became how she felt that the legal system didn't adequately address people that were affected by more than one of these identities. So, for example, the example that often comes up is, let's say there's a place that has black men and white women working there, and then there are black women working there, and the black women are discriminated against. The employers could say, well, look, we're not racist, point at the black men. They could say we're not sexist, point at the women. But then the concern is, if an employer who has problems with black women in particular, those black women don't have legal recourse. So she was trying to address that, essentially.
Okay. Yeah. And that's again, it's not a negative thing. I'm sure this does occur, and if so, I think it should be addressed. But again, I just ask for the evidence when it's brought up. Like, what is your evidence to show that this is actually happening, and then what do you prescribe we should do to prevent that?
So she wrote in 1991. She wrote this was a more famous essay called "Mapping the Margins: Intersectionality, Identity, Politics, and Violence Against Women of Color." She defined intersectionality as a provisional concept linking contemporary politics with postmodern theory. So you see, she does draw from the postmodernists. She even cites them specifically.
Okay.
She saw basically the idea of critical race theory and feminism, linking the two of them together into political activism, but adding the new identities as well. In Mapping the Margins, she wrote, "We can all recognize the distinction between the claims, quote unquote, I am black, and the claim, quote unquote, I am a person who happens to be black. I am black takes a socially imposed identity, empowers it as an anchor of subjectivity. I am black becomes not simply a statement of resistance, but also a positive discourse of self-identification, intimately linked to celebratory statements like the black nationalist, black is beautiful. I am a person who happens to be black, on the other hand, achieves self-identification by straining for a certain universality, in effect, quote unquote, I am a person, for a concomitant dismissal of imposed category, quote unquote, black, as contingent, circumstantial, non-determinate." So, put more plainly, she was saying, I am black is supposed to be an empowering identity used for activism, whereas if you say, I am a person who happens to be black, it's, well, you're just sort of passively accepting that and you're not going to do anything. That's kind of what she was saying.
Yeah, I think I'm with that latter group, because actually I have a video talking about that. Yeah, it just happened to be black, if at all, yeah.
So this was sort of one of the turning points because, again, she was influenced by postmodernism, but basically realized, well, you can't deconstruct being black, that this is a real category that has to be dealt with, and ideally she wanted it to be used to further activism. That was her point. Mm. So in Mapping the Margins, she criticized the 2 ways of understanding civilization, both the liberal approach and also the postmodern approach. Again, she didn't like the liberal approach because she complained it didn't get into how individual categories were affected. It was too broad. It didn't address specific grievances. Postmodernism, again, because you can't deconstruct being black. She wrote, for African Americans, other people of color, gays and lesbians among others, identity-based politics has been a source of strength, community, and intellectual development. The embrace of identity politics, however, has been in tension with dominant conceptions of social justice. Race, gender, and other identity categories are often treated in the mainstream liberal discourse as vestiges of bias or domination. That is, as intrinsically negative frameworks in which social power works to exclude or marginalize those who are different. According to this understanding, our liberatory objective should be to empty such as categories of any social significance. Yet implicit in certain strands of feminist and racial liberation movements, for example, is the view that the social power and delineating difference need not be the power of domination. It can instead be the source of social empowerment and reconstruction. So again, this gets to the point about how it's not just about deconstruction, but we have to use these categories to strive for reconstruction and a way of reordering society how we think will be fit. Then she says, while the descriptive project of postmodernism of questioning the ways in which meaning is socially constructed is generally sound, this critique sometimes misreads the meaning of social construction and distorts its political relevance. But to say that a category such as race or gender is socially constructed is not to say that category has no significance in our world. On the contrary, a large and continuing project for subordinated people, and indeed one of the projects for which postmodern theories have been helpful, is thinking about the way power is clustered around certain categories and is exercised against others. So, again, just sort of a rehashing of these categories, these various identities, need to be used to sort of restructure things and to illustrate how power is being used against them. Any thoughts or ideas?
Yeah, and this again, it goes to why this is very almost America-centric, specifically American city-centric, even like a certain aspect, a certain percentage of the American country is where this stuff is focused on, and that makes sense to why lived experience is a key part of this, is because they're basing this off of their lived experience.
Yeah.
That they also admit is not the same as the lived experience of other people.
Yeah.
So they seemingly can't understand why, when they say some of these things to somebody that's been a multi-generational person living in a town of like 500 people in the middle of Idaho, who's had that whole life just waking up 5 a.m. for generations, working on the farm, toiling in the earth. And then you start telling them about how they have all this privilege and power that they need to give up so they can have, so you can bring, you who are sitting at Harvard can have this change in their life and empowerment. How are they selling? Like, that's the thing. Like, it's, let alone exporting that idea and bringing it to a place here, like in Kenya, is something that I am seeing some of these fault lines coming up when I see the UN trying to talk about that recent post where they're talking about, oh, this shows that the world has been patriarchal, and they got ravaged on that response. They had a recent tweet about that by the Secretary General or something, talking about this shows about the patriarchal nature of how women and children have been affected the most by the shutdown. I'm like, wait, what? What are you talking about? So it's tough to export these things that are based off of a lived experience of a few people into a global sort of idea. And that's the same thing that you've seen with traditional theologies that were developed in certain areas according to observations of certain realities that they had, trying to be expanded to be globally, to be global ideas that talk about realities that people haven't dealt with. Yeah.
Well, I mean, Mormonism, it's like they believe Christ was in the U.S. and would return, so it's like you can't spread that worldwide. I mean, it doesn't.
Yeah, it's tougher to do with some of these things. So yeah, and maybe that's part of why I had issues with some of these basic things to begin with, where I got in and I was like, okay, what's my history with this? Of course, I don't have the ADOS history, If anything, I'm a descendant of people that were enslaved by people in the Middle East. Some great grandparent or grandmother might have been enslaved after they gave birth to whoever my ancestors were. So that could have happened, if anything. But some of the basics of the ADOS kind of history that I think is tied into a lot of critical race theory just doesn't speak to me. So that's one part that I will admit that maybe other people feel it speaks to them more and they can have more of a point of view on it. I don't know.
I don't know if you saw on my 23andMe, but I think I have it was something like 1.7% North African, North, what is it, Western Asian, and then Middle East. So I wonder if like I have an Arab ancestor like way back or something.
Yeah, it probably is. Yeah, because North African, that's the thing. When I also talked about, that's what I'm talking. It's a different thing.
Yeah.
Elon Musk is the most popular African American in the United States of America, probably, or the world. The Egyptians are considered to be Africans, but they're not Negroes. They're not black. So when it comes to that term black, that's why I'm saying it's very specific. It's something I keep repeating over and over again. There's many reasons to why when I think of the term black, when I mention that term black, I'm talking about a specific group of people in the United States of America, and that's it. Like, the people talk about this black people. Now there's all these Black Lives Matter protests and things in Europe, and I'm like, okay, Norway, like, you guys really descendants of slaves? I don't know. Like, okay.
Well, I think I might have mentioned this before, but I mentioned Algeria, and the last thing in my, I have a friend from there, and he's Berber, and the thing is, the Berber had their own culture that the Muslims sort of suppressed, but then they say that the Berber people are a mix of Roman and Germanic blood as well as North African, because the Germanic tribes that fled the Huns and other tribes, they went to North Africa, and then of course the Romans ruled it before that. So my friend looks almost European, and they were explaining that, well, it's very likely he has a lot of European blood, so if he were to do a test, you wonder, he might have Germanic and Italian blood, which is kind of cool.
Yeah.
So going on, the number of group identities, though, that are here are pretty much, it's almost infinite. I mean, this has been done with race, sex, sexuality, class, gender identity, religion, immigration status, physical ability, mental health, body size. Sometimes it breaks down even further, exact skin tone, body shape, and even, supposed alleged genders. It's sort of a straight, yeah.
I mean, I'm still hoping that at the other side of this, people will just pop out and find themselves to be an individualist. Because it's how far can you break these things down until you get to the point where you just like literally like every single individual that's the key part that we're going to have to actually focus on here. It has to get there for a lot of these people.
So it's funny in a kind of way. This is sort of my own commentary, but how like this ideology is supposed to be sophisticated and nuanced, but in a way it sort of becomes kind of simplistic, because if you're just reducing everything to power struggles, it's like you realize, anyone who thinks this through, you realize your own life doesn't work this way. You're not constantly at war with people. I mean, you have to cooperate. There's, friendship, working together, love, all that. Everything is not just a power struggle between groups. And also, again, if we keep breaking this down further and further, well, those groups are not united fronts. Like, there isn't some group of black, lesbian, trans, disabled that all works together to achieve the same thing, And
isn't there though? Well,
and where it sort of gets contradictory is that we always say, like you just said, individualism is the logical end result, but then they say no, but this is about group identities. Well, again, how does that work if not everyone has all these traits? It's just you're going to just break it down further, and then okay, does the black, lesbian, trans, disabled group, do they have power over the black, trans, lesbian group that's not disabled? Like how do you break this down? And it's just
and you already see that happening at certain protests and events where they're like, okay, now only this group can talk, that group can talk, we can't have this. Like you look at what happened in Chaz once they actually had that Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone issue in. For those of you who might be listening to this later and might have not heard about this, there was some protests that occurred in the United States of America during the pandemic, and in Capitol Hill area, this is a neighborhood or an area in Seattle. Yep. There was about a 6 square block area that was shut. It was closed off for a couple of weeks by some people, different people with different interests, and they said this was the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, and they made certain demands to to the government or to the state government of of Seattle and the United States of America, saying it's an autonomous country. And the thing crumbled, and we're still going to get a lot more information from it. Seeing the video that came out, the different arguments, the drop of actual chaos, not anarchy, chaos that started occurring in there without any actual rule of law and order and things like this. And yeah, it's interesting things when you start breaking down to that point where these people are like, aren't we all in this together? No, we're actually shooting each other. No, we actually have different warlords. Like, no, this is actually space is only for these people. And no, you're not allowed to talk. You have to talk. So there was that whole thing going on. That's yeah.
Yeah, and to use your famous analogy, Silas, intersectionality is Ebola. It kills the host faster than it can spread.
Yeah, I think that's a good one because that's what happens. Like quick, because for me, when I saw that, it was like, please don't send the federal agents in there. Just let it crumble on its own, and it did. And unfortunately, six people were shot. I think
Sounds
three
about right.
people died from that whole situation. So those lives were lost, but I think many lessons have been learned from that.
So, I mean, the system gets in all these contradictions. For example, they talk about how gay white men need to acknowledge their anti-blackness, but then non-black people of color do too, apparently. Lighter-skinned blacks need to recognize their privilege over darker-skinned blacks. You probably saw this article, I've shared it from The Root, talking about how straight black men have been called the white people of black people.
Yeah.
There's that. Trans men, some people say that trans men have male privilege, but then of course they also get called they're TERFs, which are the trans exclusionary radical feminists, which won't accept them because they say, oh, if you become a trans woman, you weren't born a woman, so you don't understand. So, but then okay, were they men originally? So, it gets complicated. Then there's this whole thing: queerness needs to be decolonized. Peter Tatchell, who's been a human rights campaigner, apparently, he talked about black rappers singing about killing gay people, and then he was accused of racism for doing that. Of course, there was something about beauticians were criticized because they wouldn't wax trans people in their nether regions because it went against their religion. So, it's like, then it's, okay, whose side do we take there? And then somebody who was the professor, Rebecca Lynn, she was a communications professor, said intersectionality is a multifaceted perspective acknowledging a richness of the multiple socially constructed identities that combine to create each of us as a unique individual. It's like, well, wait a minute, I thought it was focusing on group identities. And then how much of this is socially constructed? I mean, you undergo a gender sex reassignment surgery, that's not social construct, that's affecting your biology. So it's just, the whole thing is it's self-detonating. I mean,
that's another thing. Like if there's no biological aspect, if gender is just a social construct, I don't know if they say that in specific, but if they say race is just a social construct, then those recent two additions to the growing list of people who pretended to be one race, if it's just a socially construct, then isn't that Krug lady from George Washington or this recent person from, I forget what the recent person was, or some grad student or something.
Yeah.
They came out and apologized. And I think there's at least, looking at the way things are going, there's at least 10 people in the United States of America in their very similar condition of supposedly claiming to be one race, transracial, if I can coin that term, or you can use that term. I'm not going to coin it. I'm sure some other people have said it before. If it's a social construct, then can't Rachel Dolezal, can't Jessica Krug, can't this recent person, can't Shaun White literally be black? Are they social construct parts, or do people admit that there is a actual biological quotient to that term race, that somebody has to have at least a part of that before they can say they are of the same? Because if it's purely social, then Krug, Dolezal, this recent person, you are the 10 people out there in school that are most likely female, because it seems to be females doing this thing a lot more than males. You're black. if it's just a social construct, you don't have to actually have any race into you. Don't come out and apologize. Just own that stuff. Just be black in your powerlessness, I guess.
We'll get more into it in the queer and gender stuff, but that runs into contradictions too, because as you sort of touched on, the whole debate about what is sex versus gender, are there biological differences, are they socially constructed? And it seems like they, I'll get more in depth in that, but like it seems like they trip over themselves in all these different points.
Yeah.
So this is
Now,
this is
okay,
really
with these
interesting.
intersections, one question with the intersections, can you add or remove certain intersections due to certain things that happen in your life? Like if you're a black woman and then you somehow marry a white man who is in a different situation, uh, do his intersections somehow reduce your intersections, or do they add issues to your intersections? Are these some canceling out type of thing? You become a different unit that has a different equation?
Well, because that's sort of the challenge. Like I think I had mentioned briefly about trans men, where some people would say, "Oh, well, you're a man now; you have male privilege." But then at the same time, most people look at them and say, "Okay, this person clearly wasn't born a man," and then that has an aspect of prejudice to it as well. So again, which is it? Would it be okay? This person has male privilege, or would it be no? This person's not really a man, and then I don't know. It's like
Yeah,
it's
like a poor trans male in like the hills of West Virginia in some small town who's been disowned by their family and things like that. Technically, they're female, so they have that intersection with someone like, let's say, like LeBron James. So you have they have those ones. They might have had two parents versus LeBron James having a single mom. So where does the intersectional come on that? Those two parents have disowned that trans man now, who's now technically identifying as a white trans male living in this town below poverty, living in a trailer or something, addicted to meth or something. So that stress, who has fewer intersections, that individual or LeBron James, who's probably going to win the NBA championship this year, living in some bubble in Florida, being paid millions, getting daily tests on COVID. So this person who's addicted to drugs, dealing with these things in a trailer in the hills of West Virginia, who doesn't have one COVID test. LeBron James getting tested multiple times a day. His family members. Who has more intersections
yeah.
via intersectionality to actually deal with in a situation like that? Like, do you know? Have you seen any kind of place? And this is also an open question to anyone else. If there's something that you've seen has made some kind of sense into how you can do a 23andMe type of thing where you can test your intersections and find which intersections you truly actually stand on. I don't know.
And it sort of gets me too, because I remember I had a friend who we talked about intersectionality, and she's like, "Oh yes, there's a lot of data proving this stuff." But then I said, "Well, first off, I mean, I don't even see how that's the case, because they keep redefining. It's all these categories, all these intersecting categories, different circumstances, different people, and then again, sometimes they tell you, oh, you're not even supposed to ask for evidence. You're just supposed to go with our lived experience. So it's just I don't see any way you can develop a coherent philosophy from this. So
Yeah, we could be wrong. We
I'll
could be
get
wrong.
I found a quote. It's in the book from Crenshaw that I think is actually very telling, though. She said this in 2017 at a talk at Columbia Law School. She said, "Some people look to intersectionality as a grand theory of everything, but that's not my intention. If someone is trying to think about how to explain to the courts why they should not dismiss a case made by black women just because the employer did hire blacks who are men and women who are white, well, that's what the tool was designed to do. If it works, great. If it doesn't work, it's not like you have to use this concept. The other issue is that intersectionality can be used as a blanket to mean, well, it's complicated. Sometimes it's complicated is an excuse not to do anything." So she herself is saying this wasn't meant to be some grand theory that describes the world. And what I've noticed with a lot of the people who follow this is it's almost like they've tried to create like a new historical dialectic using this as their framework. Like, oh, the white people are oppressing the blacks in this way. Men are oppressing women in this way. These blacks are oppressing these blacks. And it's like, when you think it through, you're like, how could this even function? These are not all, this is not, these are not all people moved by some divine force, without their own volition. It just, and again, even which people are in which groups and all, it's just, it was never intended to be that way. It was meant to show blind spots in the legal system.
Yeah, and that's the thing. That's something I keep seeing with this, where people get the original and you're seeing this happen in different ways. How people say, "Oh, the Constitution is a living document," or "We want to change this." Or what did they actually mean when they were writing this? It was a different world they were living in. You look at the Bible. People say, "Okay, this is what they were writing at that time. They didn't write about this. Oh, they accepted slaves because that was going on now, but we understand that's not a thing we want to do now." But the people who use the actual Bible, use the Constitution, use it in different ways. Similar to this, you look at the stuff Marx was actually writing, and I read the things Marx is writing. I try to get information on what Marx was observing about the world, and I say from what he saw, it seems agreeable to come to those conclusions. It doesn't mean they're true. It doesn't mean they apply in practice, but people look at what Marx says, and then I look at the actions people have done due to the observations Marx was making, and some of those things go beyond the actual intent of it. And now we see it with this lady, Kim Crenshaw, seemed to
Yeah.
have a certain intent on what she was talking about with intersectionality that fit a certain area of data that she was talking about. But it's like she's going with 2 plus 2 equals 4, and then somebody else says, it's 2 multiplied by 2 equals 4, and that's accurate. But then now they'll say, now in taking that 2 plus 2, we're going to take that multiplication figure and start adding other things, when Kim was focusing just on plus. So when she goes 2 plus 3 equals 5, now that other person will say, no, the 2 is okay, but we're going to switch that plus to a multiplied. So now we'll go to 2 multiplied by 3 equals 6. Then you'll start getting different things. But then you'll be like, no, but both of us had the same answer when we were using 2 plus 2 and 2 multiplied by 2. But no, that multiplied, the intent, the actual thing that you were comparing the two things to, the purpose for that is going to actually change the actual result. I think that's kind of what I'm seeing. People see, if I use this thing and we get to the same result, but it's not exactly the same, I can use that and now start using that for other things. I don't know.
Well, they also say in the book, and I don't know if she herself said this, but they said intersectionality is meant to be a heuristic tool. It's meant to get people to question things and say, okay, is this an issue? Could it be changed? It's not this, like I say, it's not a historical dialectic. Okay, everything is operating according to these principles, and once you understand this, you understand the world. That was never the intention.
Mm-hmm.
So it was interesting too. They talk about the book I mentioned, I think in the first video, The Coddling of the American Mind by Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff, how they've argued that a lot of this has actually had a reverse cognitive behavioral therapy effect, because the idea of cognitive behavioral therapy is it's to examine your underlying beliefs, which cause you to do things like catastrophize, you oversimplify, you assume the worst, all that. And cognitive behavioral therapy is basically it's meant to sort of break you of those habits. And they said how a lot of people who suffer from anxiety, depression, and those other issues, it's usually because they do some of those things. And one of the big problems is that teaching people this stuff, and especially if you take it to the extreme, as we've talked about, if you think the whole world works this way, it has sort of the reverse effect where you constantly assume the worst in people. You assume everyone's out to get you. You assume you're under attack. And there was a good conversation with Helen Pluckrose and Carolyn Borisenko. I don't know if you know who she is. She was sorry?
I've heard the name.
Yeah, so she was an SJW who ended up becoming a big Trump supporter. She went to his rally and I guess made a lot of friends, and now she's going to vote for him and all that. And she's a psychologist by trade, and so she was talking to Helen Pluckrose about mental health, and she was sort of saying how this thing, it's bad for people both black and white, because if you tell black kids constantly, you're never going to get ahead, the system's always against you, they become hopeless, they become bitter, they become angry. But then if you're also telling white kids, well, you didn't earn all that, that's just your privilege, well, you just got lucky, all that, then what's going to happen to them? They're going to stop striving for more because they're going to have this sense of guilt about something they shouldn't really feel guilty about. And then they do these studies talking about people with self-esteem issues, and they find a lot of people have them. I think it's more for women than guys, and then it's like, well, you've helped contribute to it with this ideology.
Yeah.
And then there was also, sorry?
It's a sad situation. The results of some of these things are rather sad, and I'm glad that it's not as prevalent as it might seem. It's just the examples that we're seeing are a lot worse than it is. Even if you look at, I was just thinking there are some dysgenic effects of this, as you mentioned. You do this, and it leads to certain ideation in the people that believe these things. It leads to certain behavior where people feel the world is too terrible for me to reproduce. I'm not worthy of these things. I can't pass on certain things to my children. If I attempt something, I'm not going to be successful at it, so you don't attempt it. And you're seeing some sort of nurture, like dysgenics. And the same way how people look at the eugenics that were occurring in the world wars with the Nazis, with those groups of people, that was a small group of people that did some really horrific things with them imposing their more nurture and selection type of eugenics ideas. And this is kind of a thing where it's not as forceful as that was, of course.
Yeah.
And it's not like directly getting these people and locking them up and making sure they reproduce and doing these tests, but it is a thing where it's nurture wise, they're getting certain people like, oh, if somebody doesn't believe you in this way, put them out. I've seen posts of people, and I guess this is some tongue-in-cheek thing, where somebody posts, "Oh, I've had numerous kids," and somebody's like, "This is literally some kind of assault on humanity by this white person reproducing this much." And it's just that is a horrible thing. You have people who are like, "The world is ending. We can't have kids. I can't have a child into this world because my black child will be mistreated so horribly." And I'm like, you might have been the parent who had the genetic mixture together that has the base for a child that could cure cancer, but because you think your child would have been made fun of in high school or in college or in elementary school, you decide to not have a kid. It's sad. Maybe it's part of evolution, and we're selecting out certain people who don't know enough to actually, who aren't as capable of discerning what reality is. So maybe this is like people who weren't able to discern whether that twig cracking in the woods was a lion or just a tree, a branch falling, who weren't able to react fast enough. People who can't realize that this ideation or these ideologies aren't really a predator. It's not really a predator. It's just some twig falling, so we're not going to act on it. So maybe it's that. I don't know, but it's I feel bad.
Well, it's also too. I mean, we talk about why people are drawn to these ideologies, and I think, there's different theories, and one of them is that certain white people are drawn to it because they see themselves as like the next civil rights leaders, so they think, oh, I'm doing the next thing, and then people are going to get mad at me for saying this, but I kind of don't care. For some people, I think these ideologies are also a way out. Like, I think I don't know if I told you the story about, I had an employee who kept threatening people, and he was black, and he kept saying he was being discriminated against, and there was no evidence of it, but he kept saying it over and over. And he threatened multiple people, and eventually he got fired for it. But he kept saying, "Oh, it's because I'm black. I'm because I'm black." And I think what it is there are people do face discrimination, sure, but there also are people in the world who never want to take responsibility for what they do, so they're drawn to stuff like this because it gives them that way out. Then they can say, "Oh, it's not, I threatened people, I made bad decisions, I showed up late. No, the system's just against me." And I'm at the point, I think, where I'm very wary of people who sort of exhibit those tendencies, because it's like, these people are going to be trouble. It's like, no matter what happens, somehow, whatever they do is going to be someone else's fault. And it's just, you can't contend with that.
That's another observation that I've come to, and I think there's also a distinction I want to make here, where there's a difference between somebody being irresponsible and somebody being unresponsible.
Yeah.
And those unresponsible are the people who I'm just like, wow, those are the people I just need to completely avoid, who seem to think they're literally not capable of being an entity that could be responsible for their behavior. Everything is just them being acted upon. Yeah. Whereas the irresponsible people will be like, yeah, I could have done that different, but I decided not to. That's blasé, and that has its own issues. But then I think with those people, I can kind of think of, if this person is useful enough, or I feel I can benefit from this person, or I feel like I could converse with this person, or this person can do some good, I can maybe convince them to why they should take more responsibility over that, because they accept that them being able to be responsible over something is something within their capability, within their ability as a human being. But these people we're talking about, some of these people we're talking about, literally say it is impossible for them to be X, Y, Z. It is impossible for me to be racist inherently. No matter what I do, it's just something that I am not capable of doing. That to me is self-defeating. That unresponsible kind of thing is not a good place.
Well, you could also make the case with irresponsibility that people are responsible and irresponsible in different areas. Like, for example, there are people who are very dedicated to their careers but not great parents. Then there's other people who the opposite. well, maybe they're not, it's not that they're not dedicated to their careers, but they're not very driven, but then they're very nurturing parents. So you have to sort of look at it on a case by case basis. Okay, they may care more in this area and that shows. They care less in this area and that shows. But look at what they do right and learn from that, and then say, okay, don't do that in that area. I think that's another way.
Yeah, so that's irresponsible. Then it's another thing. I think another question to the people out there: have any of you noticed this as well? I have a few things just recently happened that I'm going to make some videos for. They might be up before I post this, where I thought of that term unresponsible, and there might be some literature or academics or studies actually done studying what that term or issue might be. But that's something that I think I recently noticed that almost gave me shivers. Like I saw someone post something and I was like, oh, like, wow, like you have to think this in order to say that. And that is really creepy. And there was an article I saw where this, I was like, I can't believe you're saying this is about somebody's personal responsibility. How can you say this? It's put like, where is that? And I think that's the same thing as we had mentioned before. Somebody close to you was talking about the issues of the United States of America is its rugged individuality. And I'm like, see, those are the people that I think they're not going to get to the other side of this intersectionality where you break it down so much to get to the individual. And I think with the people who might be more leaning to more attracted to intersectionality due to being irresponsible about certain things, they can get to the point where they realize, okay, I am irresponsible for all these other things, but I will be responsible for these things as a X, Y, Z, A, B, C, D, E, F, G.
Yeah.
But the unresponsible people will just never come to that point where they're going to be like, they're always going to find something else that is responsible for their behavior rather than them being the locus of that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was also going to add on a little bit. My introduction to Wilfred Riley was actually on Thaddeus Russell's show, and it was actually a pretty good clip where he asked him, why do black kids on college feel like they're under attack all the time? And Riley, he says he's black. I mean, he's very light skinned. He looks like, I don't know, maybe he could be, but he basically said, you know, he's like, I used to wonder this when I started looking into it, and he's like, well, look at who's in media, look at who's in academia. I mean, what is, I think media, it's like 93% of journalists identify as being on the left. I think it's like 70-something% are registered Democrats. And of course, academia, you've seen all those charts about Harvard conservatives are like point-something% and all that. So he made the point that a lot of these black students are actually middle class, upper middle class, but they're constantly bombarded with, you're under attack, you're a victim, all that. And he was saying, like, he had a few experiences where they would say, I'm under attack, and he'd be like, well, what happened to you? And they'd be like, oh, a white woman looked at me funny, and Malcolm X was assassinated. And it's like, okay, we can say one of those is not like...
Yeah, it's a bit flimsy there. It's connections.
But he said, you know, as you sort of gotten at, objectively, they're some of the like healthiest, safest, wealthiest people ever, but they're constantly bombarded with, you're under attack, you're a victim, and it's like, that's going to produce that behavior. And until we acknowledge that, things aren't going to improve. So.
I just checked up Wilfred Riley to see on Wikipedia. Sometimes they go into the ethnicity of the people or their personal bio, but that's not there. The first time I heard of him was I forgot, there was some interview. I think you might have posted the interview. He was on somebody's show. It was like an hour long, and he was talking about some things I thought were pretty good. He was one of the first people who started pointing out that, I think other people pointed this out as well, but they point out certain crime statistics or the earning statistics. They point out the earning statistics between black people and white people, but then on average, the white people white males they look at are on average 50-year-olds. Yeah. They're 50-year-old with multi-generational like families in the United States of America. That's the average white person that they're using. The average black person that they're using, a black male, is 25 years old, living in an urban area with like a single parent. That's who they're comparing the two things from. And when you compare those two things, it's going to be garbage. That's why you see something like Nigerian immigrants have a lot higher earnings than your average white male, because they normally come from a more stable family that if they're immigrating into the country with legal immigration versus coming across the border, they're coming in with chances of, I'm moving here because I have a secure job in that's a productive, that's doing certain things. I've put the planning together to go through this labyrinthine bureaucratic system that is completely pointless, in my opinion, to actually get into the actual place, wait and have the ability to do the deferral of what's the thing? Deferral of pleasure. What's the technical term of that
Deferral
thing?
of gratification.
Deferral of gratification. Yeah, to plan and say, let me save, let me do this, let me make a plan, and then in X amount of years, I'll be able to be a citizen. They have the ability to do that, and being able to do those things selects for earnings in a different way. That's why you see recent African migrants, legal African migrants, will earn more on average than multi-generational white Americans because they're selecting for different things already. It's okay, but with the thing I wanted to mention with Wilfred Riley, as you mentioned, he had these questions, just like we're asking, what's the evidence?
Yeah.
Show me the evidence and send me location, like Khabib Nurmagomedov says. If there's a problem, send me location so I can read the actual issue. He says here, the views. In 2016, Riley criticized then candidate Donald Trump for allegedly dog whistling to the alt-right and described the 2016 United States presidential campaign as a shining light on some dark corners of the internet. Now, he said that. I don't know what he believes about Trump anymore, but it's someone where it's like those issues are there, but then you go in and you look at it, and this is kind of to show that the critiques and the criticism that people are trying to analyze this are not coming at this from just like, oh, we hate these people saying these things about these people that we love. So it's like, no, it's coming from all over the place because these are valid questions, despite who or what is where they're coming from. Yeah.
I liked his commentary too about how he said something like they say the U.S. is systemically racist. Well, who are the top earners? Nigerians, Jews, and certain Asians. He goes, how did Jefferson achieve this?
Yeah. So it's a tough kind of situation, and I think maybe you have to add that whole thing where you can't consider those people part of black, because if you do, then it's like, hey, those are actually very high earners. So it's a thing.
But again, he, like Thomas Sowell, they stress you have to equalize all these categories, like you say, like it's not just income, but it's also age, where do you live, type of family, all that. And he and others have said that when you equalize a lot of that stuff, like the differences come down more to class rather than race.
Yeah.
It's just they cherry pick things to make it seem, So just a few points to sort of wrap up here. One problem with this is they call them race hustlers, people like Robin DiAngelo, who wrote White Fragility, Ibram X. Kendi, who wrote How to Be an Anti-Racist. Robin DiAngelo famously said, the question is not, did racism take place, but rather, how did racism manifest in that situation? I haven't read White Fragility entirely. I've sort of skimmed it. I have a general understanding. The book is basically a giant Kafka trap. For those who don't know,
Stephen. You got to do the work.
For those who don't know, Kafka Trap, what it basically is where it was written. It comes from a novel called The Trial, written by an Austrian author named Franz Kafka, and the idea was to illustrate how justice works in totalitarian regimes, where the protagonist is kidnapped. He's been charged with a crime. He's not sure why or what he did, and any denial of his guilt is just seen as proving the guilt, quote unquote, and eventually what happens is he's let free, but then he's killed later. I think he's stabbed through the heart. So the whole point he's trying to illustrate is that's how justice works in these countries. It's not about, okay, you're innocent until proven guilty, we weigh the evidence and we decide accordingly. It's meant to just say, okay, we want you to be guilty, so we're going to say you're guilty no matter what. And that's basically how White Fragility works of, okay, if you question this, it's because you have white fragility. If you run away, it's because you have white fragility. If you deny anything, it's because you have white fragility. So what are you supposed to do? Shut up and listen. That's basically the whole point. Go ahead.
I think that's why it's key. Part of the exceptionalism of the United States of America, as what it was established on, was that basis of having a system of justice that had the assumption of innocence. Like just that itself. That's part of why I despise things like Christianity with that original sin type of thing, that's saying every child that's born has the sin origin. Like we are just in general we're fallen beings. We're in need of saving. We're filthy. That's something that I just don't accept. I can't countenance teaching that to a child of mine. And I see people doing this, and people have been doing this for since this is the beginning of I having these ideas. It's not something uniquely new, but having that whole idea with this postmodernism thing, as we mentioned in that video, the rules of postmodernism, having that assumption that oppression is the one truth, that assumes that there is an oppressor class and people can be born into that oppressor class, like just a newborn baby is automatically in that oppressor class, and that is a disgusting thing to place on people, whether you're in the oppressor class or you're being placed in the class that's being oppressed. It's horrible.
But also too, she even says like, oh, the work is never done. You always have to strive to be better in this. So basically, what that is, the way they rope people in is, well, if you do this, it's racist. So now do this. Well, if you do this, now do this, and they just keep roping you in. And I mean, I think her seminars cost something like $12,000 a piece. So she's a millionaire. I mean, she's made money off this. But I
she's
think
been doing it for a while too. She recently came into the public eye with the book, but she's been doing those seminars for quite some time.
Yeah, it's just because of all the stuff in the news, she's sort of come to the front again. And how to be an anti-racist is basically just a giant exercise in false dichotomizing. He even says like a policy is either racist or anti-racist. That's all there is. And then if it's even something that's seemingly neutral, he finds a way to say, okay, this is racist. Like the one, I think the example with Ezra Klein, the guy from Vox, he said, is a capital gains tax cut, how is that a racist policy? He says, well, because fewer black people are invested in stocks, so that money should be taken and used to benefit black people. So again, it's basically the logical fallacy, false dichotomy. Everything is reduced to two choices, and then everything is just sort of used to fit that while ignoring all the other choices. Yep. And then his final solution is that we need an anti-racist constitutional amendment, and basically he's advocating totalitarianism. An organization should survey all these people and activities and decide if they're racist and they should be punished accordingly. But of course, what does he define as racist? Well, whatever he says. So you're at that point, it's totalitarianism, because basically whatever these people want to deem racist. So
yeah, it's a terrible thing. It's the devil's in the details, as I say. It's either something that's either godly or something that's for the devil. It's something you put on earth. If there's two things, if you have that assumption or that, if you accept that either something is either God's plan or been interfered with by the devil, then everything, you have to find ways to make that match that initial assumption. But if you don't agree with that, you might look at something, if you're not a Christian, and somebody's like, oh, look, the devil is why this person did that. You might be like, who's this devil person you're talking about? So I think that's what we're trying to do with these conversations, for you to get a better understanding of why somebody would say that about that, because they have that initial assumption of that God, devil type of thing to begin with.
Well, I also like what Coleman Hughes, I don't know if you followed him much, but what he said on Dave Rubin's show. Very, very young, very smart man. I mean, I think he's only like 23 or 24. I think if he keeps going, he could be another Thomas Sowell. He graduated from Columbia. But he made the point that the problem is that I think with leftists is that they treat racism like a disease that needs to be eradicated when they should be treating racism like murder or something. Where what he meant by that is that ideally you want zero, but what would it take to achieve a murder rate of zero? You'd have to have people surveyed all the time. You'd have to have unlawful searches and seizures. You'd have to have armed police. Like, you could conceivably get murder to zero, but at what cost, both financially and in terms of freedom. And he was saying that they should view racism that way, but they treat it like a disease. Like, if we can stamp out every last vestige of thing that could be associated, then we'll have our, happy day where this is gone forever and that's it. But reality is that'll never happen.
Yeah, it's a good way of looking at it.
Yeah. It's like, you could, if what Kendi wants to happen could, okay, you could have all these people surveyed on, nobody would say anything offensive, all that, but do you really want to live in that civilization? I mean, I don't see benefits to that long run.
Yeah.
So that about wraps it up. I mean, it's pretty much what I could find on it. I like what James Lindsay said the other day. Let me find a quote for it. He says it on his, let's see. Here we go. He goes, critical race theory begins with the presumption of guilt and racism, pretends to ask people to prove their innocence, that they're not racist, then concludes for a totally different reason than that a negative can't be proven, that a person can't be not racist, i.e. is guilty. So yeah.
Yeah, and if anyone has some reason to why that is inaccurate, please feel free to let us know. And even the content that we've talked about here, as I haven't mentioned yet in this part of the conversation, but I will be continuing this conversation series with Stephen and other people on different topics. I have one lined up talking about like the alpha males, beta males. Is that one? It's going to be a different one, a different person. Might be interesting. And with these, I think the people that I want to have these conversations with, I also want to have these conversations with the people listening. I want this to be something that we all participate in, where it gets to the point where, hey, I have this conversation with Stephen. Somebody comes in, they have a particular question for Stephen or something, then Stephen can have a separate conversation with just you, and then we can have this location where people have these different conversations and we participate. And I'll start thinking of and present a certain guidelines or rules or structure for the kind of content that we think would be best for all people involved in these conversations to have informative and useful and worthwhile conversations. And anything else?
That's all I have.
Yeah, so thank you again for spending your time with this conversation, Stephen. Like it's been great as usual. What's the next section going to be?
Queer theory.
Okay, so queer theory is going to be the next one I post in order of this series. If you're listening to this series, then at least the 3 parts have been posted that you can go and check those out. And then you can wait for, if you're listening to this as it's been posted, probably a week after I post this or sometime after, shall have the queer theory one up for you. That's it for now. I appreciate you guys taking your time to listen. Got something in my throat. Finish it up, Stephen.
Thank you all for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. Again, feel free to write in the comments if you have any questions, criticisms, or feedback of any kind.
That's it. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.